The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical prayer at 0600 hours when Danielle Ross pushed through the St. Michael's ICU doors in Atlanta, scrubs still crisp from the laundry, her badge clipped to a lanyard she'd positioned at exactly the same angle every morning for 3 weeks. No one had learned her first name yet. That was intentional. In the ICU, anonymity was armor. She moved between beds with the kind of efficiency that made work look like meditation, for bags changed with her left hand while her right hand was already reaching for the next set of vitals, her eye scanning monitors the way some people read newspapers, processing data in the space between heartbeats. 12-hour shifts felt short when you'd spent them doing field triage under mortar fire in Baghdad, when you'd learned to keep moving because stopping meant someone died. She'd learned to fold that version of herself into something smaller, quieter, less visible. Just another nurse in scrubs. Just someone doing her job. The supply room was empty at 0630, which meant Danielle had exactly 20 minutes before the morning rounds would begin and the hallways would fill with voices. She pulled the pharmaceutical inventory log from the locked cabinet and turned to the morphine section, her finger running down the column with the kind of attention most people reserved for their children. The numbers didn't add up. Not catastrophically. Not obviously. But enough that someone who had spent 14 years tracking ammunition counts in Baghdad would notice the pattern. 2 units short every Tuesday. 3 units short every Friday. The kind of discrepancy that looked like rounding error unless you were the type of person who understood that rounding error was how wars were funded and hospitals were looted. She made a small notation in the margin of the log, not enough to be obvious, just enough for her own memory to catch on later. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then she closed the book, returned it to the cabinet, and locked it with a soft click that sounded like teeth closing. The equipment replacement orders were filed in a separate cabinet, arranged by date and vendor. Danielle pulled the past 6 months and spread them across the supply room counter like a poker hand she was learning to read. Defibrillator pads ordered twice in 1 month. Monitor cables replaced at 3 times the normal frequency. A level 1 infuser that had supposedly malfunctioned after exactly 47 hours of use. She recognized this dance. She'd watched it performed in military procurement for years, the shuffle, the slow transfer of money from one account to another, the transformation of legitimate expenses into something darker. Her hand stayed steady as she photographed each order with the phone she kept in her locker, a phone that no one at St. Michael's knew was registered to a Pentagon extension. Pain was information. Corruption was just another kind of data. She was replacing the files when Dr. Mercer passed the supply room window, his white coat moving past like a shark's fin cutting water. Danielle felt his presence register, that subtle shift in air pressure that came from watching someone notice they were being watched. But she didn't look up. She didn't change her breathing. She simply continued organizing the cabinet with the same mechanical precision she'd been using when he walked by, as if his observation of her was as irrelevant as the fluorescent lights overhead. It wasn't irrelevant. She knew that. But he didn't need to know that she knew. By 0700, the morning routine had begun. The ICU filled with the sound of monitor alarms, the squeaking of stretcher wheels, the hum of mechanical ventilators working through their programmed cycles, each breath a small mechanical surrender. Danielle moved between her assigned beds, 4 of them today, all of them critical, all of them the kind of patients that separated competent nurses from the kind who just counted down the hours until shift change. She took vital signs with hands that never hesitated, with eyes that saw what other people missed, with the kind of quiet authority that came from understanding that hesitation was the enemy of healing. And then she passed room 347. The name on the chart was James Harding. Navy SEAL. Age 42. Admitted 3 days ago with undiagnosed complications that had the attending physicians whispering to each other in that particular tone of voice that meant nobody understood what they were looking at. Oxygen mask covering his face, his breathing shallow and mechanical, his muscular frame diminished against white sheets the way all strong people looked when they were helpless. But it was the face, the precise angle of the jaw, the particular shape of the scar tissue along his left temple, the way his hands rested at his sides like they were made from iron, that made her stop moving for exactly 1 second. Lieutenant Commander James Harding. the man who had led her son through 3 deployments in Helmand Province and Loga Valley. The man who had sent her a handwritten letter after her son's last mission, the one where 3 of his 12 Marines had come home in flag-draped boxes. The man she'd heard her son call sir with a tone of voice that was part fear and part absolute trust. She continued walking. Her pace didn't change. Her breathing remained steady. But her neural pathways had just shifted into a different configuration entirely, the way they did when a mission briefing moved from theoretical to immediate. She reviewed his chart during the 0800 medication prep, standing at the nursing station with Harding's file open in front of her, her eyes moving across the page with the kind of speed that made it look like casual reading to anyone watching. Admitted with fever of 103.4 degrees Fahrenheit. Elevated white cell count at 18,400. CT scans that showed possible pneumonia, though the radiologist's note read like a shrug. Started on broad-spectrum antibiotics, vancomycin, piperacillin tazobactam, ciprofloxacin, a pharmaceutical carpet-bombing approach that meant the doctors were guessing. The morphine dosages were marked in the chart, administered at intervals that seemed routine to anyone who wasn't reading too carefully. But the timing was wrong. The amounts were escalating in a pattern that didn't match his symptoms. Harding's pain scores had been stable, documented consistently at a 3 or 4 out of 10, which was remarkable for someone with his injuries. Yet his morphine had been increased 4 times in 48 hours. She felt her hands move to her pocket where the Pentagon phone rested, then caught herself and pulled them back. Not yet. Not until she had more. Not until she understood the whole shape of what she was looking at. "You settling in all right?" The voice came from her right side, from the direction where Dr. Mercer was positioned, standing close enough that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and suffocating, like money given the shape of a liquid. He was smiling. His teeth were very white and very even, the kind of teeth that came from childhood money and orthodontists named Braxton. His eyes were not smiling. They were the color of wet concrete, and they were watching her with the particular intensity of someone who had noticed something was slightly off in the arrangement of a room and couldn't quite remember what belonged where. "Fine, thank you, doctor." Her voice came out in the tone she'd cultivated over 3 weeks, deferential without being obsequious, professional without being memorable. She didn't look directly at him. She let her attention remain partially on the medication dispensary in front of her, as if his question was polite but ultimately unimportant. "You've been asking a lot of questions about the supply room." It wasn't a question. It was a statement delivered with the kind of casual tone that made it sound like an observation rather than an accusation. He was still smiling. "About inventory. Equipment replacements. That sort of thing." Danielle's hands continued their work, drawing up medications with the precise mechanical movement of someone who'd done this enough times that it required no conscious thought. "I like to understand the systems I work with." "That's admirable." He was still standing too close. She could feel the air pressure change around him, the way it did around men who were used to taking up space and having the world rearrange itself accordingly. "But we're not a place where the nursing staff gets too invested in back-end logistics. That's administrative. You understand? You're here to care for patients. Let the administrators worry about the numbers." She capped the syringe and placed it on the medication cart with deliberate precision. "Yes, doctor." "Good." He smiled wider, and now his teeth looked like they belonged to something that hunted. "I'd hate to see a capable nurse like you get distracted from what really matters. Hospitals are political places. People who ask too many questions about things that don't concern them sometimes find themselves struggling to move up. Struggling to get the shifts they want. Struggling, frankly, to keep their credentials intact. You follow?" She turned toward him then, slowly, deliberately, her eyes meeting his with the kind of absolute calm that came from having already survived the worst this world had to offer. "Yes, doctor. I understand." "Excellent." He held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds longer than was comfortable. Then he turned and walked away, his white coat moving past her like a shark's fin cutting water once more. She watched him go, her face empty of expression, her hands perfectly steady, her breathing exactly normal. but her mind was mapping the shape of what this moment meant. Dr. Mercer had just identified her as a potential threat. Dr. Mercer was now going to begin preparing a counter-response. Dr. Mercer had no idea who he'd just finished threatening. That was going to be a problem for him. Danielle finished her medication prep and began her rounds, moving through the ICU with the same mechanical efficiency she'd displayed that morning, checking vitals on patients whose names she would learn and whose deaths she could not prevent, whose lives depended on systems that were supposed to heal and were instead, she now understood with absolute clarity, being used to steal. Room 347 came last on her rotation. She entered quietly, checking the monitors first. Oxygen sat at 88%, heart rate elevated at 103, blood pressure 134/78. The fever was still holding at 102 degrees. The morphine was still wrong. She was pulling the chart to update his vitals when James Harding's eyes opened. They were the color of storm clouds, and they were very, very aware. For exactly one moment, something flickered across his face, a muscle memory of recognition, maybe, or an instinct that had been trained into him so deeply that even unconsciousness couldn't override it. Then his expression settled back into the flat exhaustion of a very sick man. But his hand, the one closest to the bed rail, moved slightly. Just enough. Just barely enough for her to see it. She wrote his vitals in the chart and checked his full line with professional detachment, her movements exactly what any competent nurse would have performed. But as she was turning to leave, she let her hand brush against the bed rail for exactly 1 second longer than necessary. His hand moved again. His fingers straightened from their resting position into something that looked almost like readiness. Danielle walked out of room 347 and back toward the nursing station, her mind already 3 moves ahead, already calculating the shape of a problem that had just gotten infinitely more complicated. James Harding was awake now. James Harding knew something. And whatever he knew, whoever had put him in the hospital bed with escalating morphine dosages and undiagnosed complications, was now working against someone who had trained her for exactly this kind of situation. The question wasn't what she was going to do. The question was how much damage Dr. Mercer would do before she was finished with him. The morphine dosage on the chart didn't match the clinical presentation. Danielle stood at the bedside of room 347, studying the medication administration record while the Callahan family occupied the adjacent space, their voices a low murmur of concern for their own dying relative. Lieutenant Commander Harding's respiration rate was depressed, 8 breaths per minute when 12 was the minimum safety threshold, and his pupils had constricted to pinpoints. The last dose had been documented at 1400 hours. It was now 1615. 6 milligrams when the standard post-surgical protocol for a man his size called for 4. She checked the handwriting. Dr. Mercer's signature, unmistakable in its aggressive slant. She didn't hesitate. The question came out calm, professional, the kind of observation a competent nurse made 100 times a shift. Doctor, I'm noting the 1400 morphine dose was 2 milligrams above the documented order. Should I flag this for pharmacy? Her voice carried just far enough that Mrs. Callahan's head turned. That was the mistake. Not asking the question. Asking it where someone could hear. Dr. Mercer arrived in the ICU 7 minutes later, his face arranged in an expression of absolute patience, the mask a predator wears before the kill. He found her at the supply cart restocking dressing trays. Nurse Ross. A word. Now. Not a request. An order delivered in the tone of a man accustomed to obedience. He walked toward Harding's room without checking if she followed. She followed. The door closed behind them with a hydraulic whisper. Mercer positioned himself between Danielle and the patient, his body language deliberate, a barrier. You're new here, so let me educate you about how we operate at St. Michael's. His voice moved through the small room like a blade through silk, each word honed sharp. Nurses who forget their place don't last long. I don't need a weekend warrior second-guessing my prescriptions, especially not in front of patients and their families. That kind of insubordination undermines the entire care team. You want to know what you do. You check the bags. You change the sheets. You smile at the families and tell them everything is under control. You do not, and I cannot stress this enough, you do not question doctors in front of anyone. Are we clear? The silence that followed was the kind that comes after a slap. Mercer's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a man who had just publicly humiliated someone he viewed as subordinate. He waited for contrition. An apology. A nod of submission. What he got instead was Danielle's gaze meeting his without wavering, her jaw set in a line that could have cut glass, and then she turned back to Harding's vital signs monitor as if Mercer had never spoken at all. She reached for the fall line, checking the flow rate with the focused precision of someone whose attention had already moved past him entirely. Mrs. Callahan, in the adjacent space, had witnessed every word of it. Danielle heard her whisper something to her husband, the clinical shame of public correction settling over the room like anesthesia gas. Mercer left without another word, but his absence carried more weight than his presence. The door closed again. Danielle continued her work, hand steady, breathing even. The trembling would come later. Not now. Never now. By the lunch hour on Friday, the break room had become a study in the social architecture of institutional hierarchies. Danielle sat down at the table with her tray, a turkey sandwich and apple, nothing more, and within 30 seconds, for nursing staff who had occupied that space moments before suddenly developed urgent business elsewhere. One nurse remembered a supply order that needed checking. Another had a phone call to return. A third discovered a medication discrepancy that required immediate documentation. The fourth simply stood, gathered her bag, and left without explanation. The fluorescent ceiling fixture overhead emitted its endless mechanical hum, a sound Danielle had learned to filter out during her years in Baghdad, where that same kind of ambient noise meant you were still alive. She ate alone. The sandwich was dry. She didn't taste it. The write-up appeared on the unit board Monday morning, printed on official St. Michael's letterhead and posted where every staff member would see it during shift change. Her name. Dated Friday at 16:45. The charge nurse must have taken it directly from Mercer's dictation without asking questions. The language was clinical, damaging, precise. Danielle Ross, insubordination. Procedural violations. Failure to follow physician orders. Detailed documentation of her unauthorized questioning of a medical decision in front of patients. A pattern was being constructed, one file at a time. Co-workers read it as they passed the board, and Danielle watched their eyes slide away from hers, the way eyes do when a person has begun to become invisible. What they didn't know was that Mercer wasn't finished. Not even close. That same afternoon, the ICU schedule posted for the following week showed her name removed from the night shift rotation, the shift where she had been assigned to Harding's care team. Instead, she was reassigned to post-surgical recovery on the opposite wing. The rotation change had no notation, no official explanation. Just a new name in her time slot and her own name transplanted into a unit where she had no access to room 347. In the break room, when she checked the posted schedule, her hands remained absolutely still. But what happened in the supply closet 2 hours later was different. The supply closet was 4 meters by 3, lined with shelves holding gauze rolls, trauma shears, elastic bandages, and 4 supplies stacked in precise military rows. Danielle was taking inventory when the realization struck her with the force of shrapnel. Harding's chart showed his oxygen saturation declining. His breathing pattern had deteriorated. She'd reviewed his medication protocol during a bathroom break, documenting her observations in the nursing notes in the precise language of someone trained to report observations under fire. 2 hours later, when she attempted to access the electronic system to check if pharmacy had reviewed her note, her security badge no longer opened the ICU medication room door. The light blinked red. Access denied. Her hands trembled. Not from fear. Not from humiliation or shame. From the cold calculation of understanding exactly what was happening. Mercer had moved from public humiliation into strategic elimination. He was isolating her from the patient. Cutting her access to systems. Building a record that would support a termination for cause. And he was doing it with the methodical efficiency of someone protecting something worth destroying a single nurse's career to conceal. The trembling lasted 3 seconds. Then her hand steadied and she finished counting Gore's rolls. 92 in stock. 48 needed to reach standard supply levels. The numbers were mechanical, useful, grounding. She documented the count on the clipboard in handwriting that revealed nothing of what was happening behind her sternum. When she emerged from the supply closet, her face was arranged in the same expression of quiet competence it had been before she entered. By Monday evening, the pattern of Mercer's strategy became unmistakable. The night shift staff had been reshuffled. Witnesses who had worked alongside Danielle on previous rotations were now assigned to different units. The ICU night charge nurse, a woman named Patterson who had been friendly during her first week, was moved to the step-down unit. The assignment changes were framed as routine scheduling optimization. Nobody questioned them because in hospitals, staffing changes happen constantly. But Danielle understood the architecture of what was being built around her. Mercer was scattering witnesses, removing anyone who might testify to her competence, constructing a paper narrative that would make her dismissal inevitable. She was assigned to post-surgical recovery, a unit where her shift ran from 1400 to 2200 hours. The timing was deliberate. When the ICU night shifts began, she was already gone. She checked Harding's chart during a routine break, swiping her card only to find her access now restricted. The electronic system no longer permitted her to view his medications, his orders, or his vital signs. She tried reaching the ICU charge nurse on her cell phone. Voicemail. She left a message. It wasn't returned. At 21:45 on Wednesday night, as she completed her final documentation in post-surgical recovery, the code alarm sounded. The distinctive urgent tone that meant cardiac compromise, respiratory failure, or sudden decompensation. The overhead announcement followed, code blue. ICU. Room 347. Harding. It was Harding. Danielle's shift ended in 15 minutes. She was not assigned to ICU. Her electronic access was restricted. The protocols were clear. This was not her patient, not her responsibility, not her domain. She dropped her pen, stood, and ran toward the stairwell anyway. The rules had never meant much to someone trained to operate when the rules stopped making sense. Her uniform badge swung against her chest as her feet took the stairs 2 at a time, her breathing controlled, her mind already parsing differential diagnoses. Tension pneumothorax. Massive pulmonary embolism. Cardiogenic shock. Something Mercer had missed because he was too focused on protecting his theft to notice his patient was dying. She burst through the ICU doors at 21:52, 14 minutes before her shift officially ended, already formulating what she would do and what it would cost her when Mercer found out she was there. The night shift dissolved in Mercer's hands like spilled saline. He moved through the ICU with the quiet confidence of someone who had never been questioned, never faced real resistance, only the compliant silence of nurses trained to accept hierarchy as scripture. By 0300, the roster had been rebuilt in his image. Chen, who worked Tuesday nights and had seen Danielle stabilize 2 septic patients with textbook precision, was reassigned to pediatrics effective immediately, a lateral move on paper, a removal of witnesses in practice. Morrison, the charge nurse who had watched Danielle's hands work with the fluid certainty of someone trained in military medicine, suddenly found herself scheduled for weeks in the telemetry unit across the hospital. Kowalski, who had actually been in room 347 when Danielle caught the early signs of Harding's deterioration, received a text at 02:15 informing her that her shift had been cut due to budget constraints. 3 witnesses. Scattered like ash. Mercer didn't need to fabricate documentation for these moves. He had the authority to shuffle staff assignments, and the hospital administrators were far too consumed with budget spreadsheets to question the logistics of internal transfers. He was systematically dismantling the structure of evidence before anyone could piece together what had actually happened in that room. The schedule board reflected his second calculation. Danielle's name, which had appeared in the 7 to 19 slot for the past week, vanished from Harding's care team rotation entirely. Not fired. Not yet. That would draw attention, trigger questions, create a paper trail that even a cursory HR review might flag. Instead, she was reassigned to the pediatric ICU, a unit 14 floors below, where sick children lived in rooms that smelled like plastic tubing and parental desperation. A promotion in title, pediatric nursing, was considered specialized, but a burial in function. She would be removed from the facility where Harding lay recovering. She would be unable to monitor his condition, unable to verify that his medications aligned with his actual symptoms, unable to serve as a witness to whatever narrative Mercer chose to construct. The beauty of the maneuver was its institutional plausibility. Staff got reassigned. Nurses moved between units. No one would see predatory intent in a simple scheduling adjustment. The hospital would simply process it as administrative efficiency. The third move was surgical. Mercer sat at his office terminal at 0342 and submitted an access restriction through the hospital's information security system. Danielle's login credentials, which had previously allowed her to view electronic health records for any patient in the ICU, were now limited to pediatric patients only. The system flagged the change as routine, credential scope reduction due to departmental transfer. Automated. Efficient. Her badge would still open the ICU doors, but her digital hands would be bound. She couldn't access Harding's chart. Couldn't see the medications Mercer ordered. Couldn't verify the dosages, the timing, the clinical rationale. Couldn't build a case because the institution itself would prevent her from gathering evidence. The hospital's own infrastructure would work as his accomplice. This was the competence that separated predatory administrators from common bullies. Mercer understood that power flowed through systems, not through volume or aggression. A loud Doctor Who yelled was manageable. A quiet one who understood bureaucracy was a problem that never announced itself until it was too late. The calls began at 04:15. Mercer sat in the darkness of his office, the city sprawling below his 7th-floor window like a circuit board of lights, and dialed Richard Castellano, the hospital's chief administrative officer. Mercer's voice was measured, the tone of a concerned colleague reporting a troubling situation in confidence. "Richard, I need to flag something before it becomes a liability. The new nurse, the one I mentioned last week, she performed an invasive procedure tonight without authorization. A needle decompression on Lieutenant Commander Harding. Full emergency intervention, no resident present, no physician supervision." He let that settle. "I'm not suggesting negligence. I'm suggesting someone who doesn't understand the hierarchy of medical decision-making. Someone who might act outside her scope of practice when she thinks she knows better than the doctors." The word "someone" was key. Not this woman or this nurse. Something. Something that could be documented. Something that could accumulate. "I'm going to have to document this formally. I wanted you to know it was coming. I wanted you to know I'm handling it professionally, because the last thing St. Michael's needs is a lawsuit from a family who believes their loved one was treated by someone operating beyond her credentials." Castellano's response was predictable: concern, assurances, a promise to review the incident. Mercer hung up knowing that the seed was planted. Richard would mention it to his supervisor. His supervisor would mention it to legal. By the time Danielle completed another shift, there would be 3 layers of institutional concern, all of it moving against her like weather patterns converging into a storm. The other calls were variations on the same theme. A text to Patricia Huang, the ICU's nursing director: "We need to discuss credential management and scope of practice violations." An email to the hospital's chief of medicine: "I've documented a serious concern regarding unauthorized invasive procedures." Each communication was clinical, buttressed with just enough professional language to sound like legitimate process improvement rather than targeted destruction. This was Mercer's real skill, the ability to weaponize the hospital's own systems against someone. He wasn't building a case based on what Danielle had done. He was building a termination file based on what he could make sound dangerous, what he could frame as a threat to institutional liability, what he could position as a matter of patient safety rather than competitive silencing. The pharmaceutical discrepancies he'd been running for 3 years, the medications diverted to his brother-in-law's pharmaceutical consulting business, the equipment failures that necessitated purchasing from a company that funneled kickbacks directly into Mercer's personal accounts, those would never appear in writing. But a nurse who performed a procedure without authorization? That would be documented, reported, escalated, permanent. By 05:30, when the morning shift began filtering in with their coffee thermoses and their practiced indifference to the night that had just ended, Danielle understood with the clarity that comes from combat experience that her position had fundamentally shifted. She was no longer an asset conducting an intelligence operation. She was a target. Mercer had moved past the public humiliation, past the obvious sabotage. He had entered the stage of systematic institutional destruction, the kind that left no visible fingerprints, only the irrefutable trail of paperwork. The mission, to monitor Harding for intelligence about the Baghdad operation, to verify whether the asset believed lost had actually been compromised, to determine if the two operators who died had been casualties of bad intel or casualties of betrayal, that mission was now jeopardized by her continued presence. If she stayed, she would be fired before she could gather what she needed. If she pushed back, she would draw attention to the very investigation that needed to remain invisible. Mercer, in his cold competence, had calculated something that most bullies never understand: he didn't need to defeat her. He needed to make her irrelevant. He needed to remove her access before she could prove what she suspected. He needed to build a formal record of misconduct before she could expose his theft. The fluorescent lights of the pediatric ICU were a different frequency than the ones that had illuminated her nights in the main unit. Everything here was smaller ventilators for smaller lungs, smaller fill lines, smaller doses of medications for bodies that weighed less than her tactical vest had weighed in Fallujah. She moved through the morning as if she had always worked here, as if she had never stood in room 347 calculating probabilities and distances and the precise angle of needle insertion that would save James Harding's life. The reassignment had been delivered by email at 0600, a scheduling notification with no explanation, no transition briefing, no conversation. Just a change of assignment. Just the institutional machinery grinding forward. She had nodded when she read it, not the nod of acceptance but the nod of someone acknowledging a tactical reality. Her cover had been compromised. Mercer had identified her as a threat and was moving to neutralize her. The thing that made her hand steady, the thing that kept her voice at the precise volume of a person simply reading a work schedule and accepting new orders, was the knowledge that she had trained for this. She had been extracted from worse positions. She had operated with fewer resources. She had functioned when every system designed to support her had been removed. But this time was different. This time the mission was personal. This time the patient in room 347 was the man who had led her son through 3 rotations through the Helmand province, the officer who had sent her personal messages when her son's convoy was overdue, the commanding officer who had been the last known contact before her son's unit went dark for 18 hours that changed everything about her life. Mercer didn't know that. Mercer didn't know that she was monitoring Harding not because of some abstract intelligence collection operation, but because James Harding was the only person alive who might have answers about what had actually happened in Baghdad. About whether her son had died in combat or died because someone at the Tactical Operations Center had sent him into a zone already compromised by enemy intelligence. About whether his death had been accident or execution. And now Mercer had systematically removed her access to the one person who might tell her. Now she was locked out of the building she had entered as a shadow operative. Now she was irrelevant to her own mission, which meant she had no reason to maintain her cover, no reason to keep playing the role of a quiet nurse accepting insults and indignity. The question that moved through her as she walked the pediatric ward, checking monitor readings and adjusting full lines for children who would never know the weight of the decisions being made around them, was simple: what happens when someone has nothing left to lose? The crash cart was already moving when Danielle heard the monitor flatline from 3 rooms down. She didn't run. She walked. Measured. Controlled. The pediatric ward was quiet at 2 in the morning, the kind of quiet that made every footstep sound like a confession, but she moved through it like someone walking toward something inevitable. Room 347. The door was unlocked. Harding's chest wasn't moving. His lips had gone the color of old bone. The ventilator was pushing air into dead space, his oxygen saturation bleeding downward like a timer nobody wanted to watch. 72%. 68. Falling. Danielle was already gloved before the resident stumbled in, still half asleep, still buttoning his shirt. He blinked at the monitor and opened his mouth to speak. She didn't wait for words. Tension pneumothorax, she said. Get me a 14-gauge angiocath. Right side. Second intercostal space. The resident hesitated. That hesitation lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it was long enough for Harding's oxygen to drop to 56%. Long enough for his heart rate to climb into the 140s. Long enough for Danielle to move. She already knew where the needle kit was kept. She already knew her landmarks. The second rib. The midclavicular line. A tension pneumothorax kills fast, air trapped in the pleural space, collapsing a lung, crushing the heart, suffocating the patient from the inside out. She'd done this once before in the back of a Humvee screaming through Baghdad's western approach, a Marine whose lung had been shredded by shrapnel, the needle going in while incoming fire hammered the vehicle like God was angry. The muscle memory was a living thing inside her hands. She found the site by touch, one hand palpating the ribs while the other held the needle at 45 degrees, and she moved with the kind of precision that comes from having done the same motion hundreds of times in training and twice in the blood and chaos of actual war. The skin was warm. The needle was cold. The world narrowed to just this, the target, the trajectory, the moment the needle breached the pleural membrane. The hiss came like a ghost escaping. Air. Pressure releasing. The sound of a pneumothorax decompressing is specific, a whisper made of relief and physics and the narrow margin between death and one more breath. Danielle watched the monitor. 58. 64. 70. 78. The cardiac rhythm came back like someone switching on a light. His chest rose. Fell. Rose again. A normal human being. She was still standing there, the needle in place between Harding's ribs, when Dr. Mercer walked in. He was fully dressed despite the hour. His hair was combed. He moved like a man who'd been waiting for this moment, like he'd already calculated what he would see and what he would do about it. His eyes went to the needle. To Danielle's hand holding it steady. To Harding's oxygen saturation now climbing toward 92. You performed an invasive procedure without authorization, Mercer said. Not a question. A statement being placed into evidence. Danielle didn't turn around. She secured the needle with a dressing, her movements precise enough to be art, and stepped back. He was in cardiac arrest. No resident. No attending. Death was the only alternative. You exceeded your scope of practice. He's alive. You could have waited. For what? She turned then, and something in her voice made the resident step backward like he'd been shoved. 3 more minutes? His O2 was 56%. His heart was in arrest. There's a procedure. I knew it. I performed it. He survived. That's the only calculus that matters. Mercer's jaw tightened. She watched him process this, watched him realize that she'd just saved a life in front of a witness, which meant there was no way to bury this, no way to make it disappear into the margins of an oversight committee. He'd made a different calculation, though. She could see it moving behind his eyes like sharks circling, the machinery of institutional retaliation already spinning up. St. Michael's will be dealing with the liability implications of this, he said quietly. You'll be hearing from administration. He left. Danielle stood beside Harding's bed, watching the monitor trace out normal sinus rhythm, watching the oxygen saturation hold steady at 93%. The man was breathing. The man was alive. In 8 hours, Mercer would find a way to make that her crime. The morning sun came over Atlanta like an accusation. Danielle sat in the administrative office on the 16th floor, where the hospital CEO had an actual view of the city and the air smelled like expensive coffee and the particular anxiety of litigation. Mercer was already there, sitting in the chair beside her with the posture of a man who'd visited this office many times before. The termination letter was already printed. "Gross negligence," the CEO read aloud, his voice the practiced sympathy of someone delivering bad news for the 100th time. "Unauthorized invasive procedure. Violation of scope of practice. The hospital's liability insurance requires immediate termination in cases where nursing personnel exceed their." "He was dying," Danielle said. The CEO blinked. "I understand. But protocol exists for a reason. If a resident isn't available, the proper procedure is to escalate to the charge nurse, who then." "While I was escalating, he was dying." She didn't raise her voice. The words came out flat, factual, like reading a checklist. His oxygen was in the 50s. His heart wasn't beating. The needle decompression took 90 seconds. He's alive. Every other consideration is secondary to that fact. Mercer smiled. It wasn't a kind expression. "We can't have nurses playing hero. Someone could have died." "Someone did die," Danielle said. "Until he didn't." The CEO shuffled the papers in front of him, uncomfortable. "The decision is final. We'll provide severance, 2 weeks' notice if you'd like to work it, or immediate separation with continuation of benefits through the end of the month. Security will escort you to retrieve your personal belongings." She signed the papers. The pen was a nice one, heavy, the kind someone important used to sign important things. Her signature looked like someone else's, careful and military, and nothing like the handwriting of a nurse who'd just been erased. The basement laundry was fluorescent bright and warm from the industrial dryers, the air thick with the ghost of 1,000 bleach treatments. The attendant barely looked up as she carried the blue scrubs to the folding table. They were thin from washing, soft as skin, the fabric so worn you could nearly see through them if you held them up to the light. She folded them the way she'd been taught. Crease. Fold. Stack. Each movement exact, muscle memory from officer candidate school, from 14 weeks of learning that precision was a form of respect, that discipline lived in the small things. The scrubs went into the hospital laundry bin. She pulled off her jacket, the civilian one, navy blue, the kind that let her pass through the world without comment, and reached inside the lining. The patch was smaller than most people would think. A faded image of a seal trident on worn fabric, the embroidered edges soft from thousands of moments just like this one. First Force Reconnaissance Company. 3 deployments. 2 men left in Baghdad who wouldn't come home. The patch had been stitched into the lining by her mother in 2008, before Danielle had even enlisted, like she'd known all along that her daughter would spend a lifetime hiding. She touched it once, pressed her palm against it like she was checking for a heartbeat, then hung the jacket on the return rack. The locker in her apartment was full of civilian clothes, the careful wardrobe of someone who needed to disappear. She was folding them at 6 in the evening, moving mechanically through the motions, stack the shirts, smooth the wrinkles, fold the jeans in thirds, when her phone rang. Unknown number. Atlanta area code. She answered. Captain Ross. The voice was male, precise, the kind of voice that belonged to people who gave orders and expected them to be followed. "You have a situation at St. Michael's. Lieutenant Commander Harding's condition has escalated. Tomorrow, 0900. Dress uniform. Room 347. You're not finished yet." The line went dead. Danielle held the phone to her ear for another 10 seconds, listening to the silence, then set it down on the pile of folded clothes. The dress uniform was in the back of the closet, in a garment bag she hadn't opened in 3 months. Navy blue. The fabric was heavier than scrubs. The weight of it across her shoulders felt like becoming someone else, or maybe it felt like becoming herself again. She pressed the uniform. She polished the shoes. She arranged the ribbons on the chest of the jacket in the precise order dictated by Navy regulation, combat ribbons on the left, qualification badges on the right, every color a story of a place and a moment that most people would never know. By 0845, she was standing in the hospital lobby in full uniform, and people were stopping. The security guard did a double take. The volunteers at the information desk went quiet. A woman in street clothes held the elevator door open like she'd just recognized something extinct. 2 Pentagon officials in suits were waiting. A Marine major she remembered from Ramadi. Had he been a captain then, or a gunnery sergeant? The details blurred when you were trying to survive, stood beside them like he'd been waiting specifically for this moment. "Captain," the major said, and saluted. Room 347 was crowded. Harding was awake now, sitting up, his oxygen saturation steady at 94%, his color something resembling human. Dr. Mercer and the hospital CEO were already there, summoned for what they'd assumed was a malpractice hearing. "Shadow 6, Harding said, and his voice cracked on the words. Danielle's jaw tightened. That call sign hadn't been used outside of classified channels since 2009. The major stepped forward with a citation in his hands. The paper was official, the kind that changed the way institutions treated you. Captain Danielle Ross, United States Navy. For exceptional service to the nation. She watched Mercer's face drain of color. 3 bronze stars for Valor, the major continued, reading each word like it was being entered into history. Earned during combat operations in Baghdad, Iraq, 2008 and 2009. The CEO leaned toward Mercer, whispering something. Mercer wasn't listening. Silver Star for gallantry in action under sustained enemy fire. Medical extraction mission. 2 Navy SEALs brought to safety against overwhelming odds. A nurse in the doorway gasped. 2 others pulled out their phones. The word spread like fire across a dry field. SEAL team, the whispers said. SEAL operations. A woman who'd been folding her clothes in an apartment 12 hours ago, who'd been terminated for saving a life, was apparently someone else entirely. "This is fraud," Mercer said. His voice had changed. There was a sharpness to it now, panic underneath the authority. "Stolen Valor. I want to see credentials. This woman was terminated yesterday for gross negligence. For performing an unauthorized procedure. I have documentation." 2 FBI agents stepped from the hallway. One held a warrant. The other held a tablet displaying what looked like files, hospital records, the kind of documentation that meant everything was already finished. "Dr. Mercer," the first agent said. "We've been auditing St. Michael's financial records for 6 weeks. Your pharmaceutical procurement contracts, your equipment replacement patterns, your insurance coding discrepancies." Captain Ross was placed at St. Michael's under classified assignment, the Pentagon official continued, and his voice was the kind that came from people who controlled armies. "To monitor this patient and investigate irregularities flagged by military medical auditors. When you attempted to alter her personnel file in the hospital system," the second FBI agent said, "her security clearance is tagged at the federal level. The alteration triggered an automatic alert." Mercer opened his mouth. Closed it. His hands were shaking. Harding pressed something into Danielle's palm. Cold. Metal. The weight of recognition. A Navy Cross. The citation read, "For heroism in action against enemy forces in Baghdad, Iraq. Captain Ross's leadership and medical expertise under fire saved the lives of 3 Navy SEALs and preserved critical intelligence. Your son's coming home," Harding said. "The operation you ran here broke the network that took him. The information you gathered, staying quiet, staying invisible, it changed everything. He's alive because of what you did in this hospital." The room went silent. The kind of silent where you could hear the fluorescent lights humming like they were singing, like they were announcing something the whole world needed to know. The room went silent. The kind of silent where you could hear the fluorescent lights humming like they were singing, like they were announcing something the whole world needed to know. Then the elevator doors opened at the end of the hallway, and 2 men in dark suits stepped out, their movements synchronized like they'd trained together for years. Behind them came a Marine major in dress blues, his ribbons catching the institutional light. Danielle's chest tightened. She recognized him instantly, Major Clayton, from Ramadi, 2009. From the operation that had cost 2 operators and nearly exposed an asset inside the Republican Guard. He saw her and gave the smallest nod. Just enough to say, "Your cover's blown. And you're about to find out why." The suits walked past the nursing station without looking left or right. They moved with the kind of purpose that made hospital staff step aside automatically, the way water parts for a blade. One of them carried a leather folder. Not the kind you see in medical records. The kind you see in federal investigations. Major Clayton followed 3 paces behind, his jaw set like he was walking toward something he'd been waiting 6 months to see. They stopped at room 347. Danielle followed, staying 3 steps back, moving like she belonged there but knowing everyone could feel her presence shifting the air. Harding was sitting up in bed now, fully awake, breathing without a ventilator. His eyes were clear. Focused. He'd been waiting for this. His full line was taped to his left forearm, and his right hand rested on top of the blanket, steady as a monument. One of the suits stepped into the hallway and made a call. Dr. Mercer to room 347. Now. No, please. No request. It wasn't a phone call, it was a summons. The tone of someone used to giving orders that moved governments. 3 minutes later, Mercer arrived with the hospital CEO, both of them moving with the confident stride of men who assumed this was a malpractice meeting, an insurance issue, something they could manage with lawyers and settlements. Mercer's face was composed. The face of someone who'd successfully buried his crimes for 18 months straight. He didn't see Danielle standing in the corner. Or if he did, he didn't register her as anything more than another witness he could intimidate later. The suits entered the room behind them. The door closed to a crack, just enough that Danielle could hear every word. Harding's voice came first, raspy from weeks of sedation but solid as bedrock. Shadow 6, you saved my life. Shadow 6. Her call sign from Baghdad. Her real name. The one she'd buried under scrubs and false credentials. The Marine stepped forward and began reading. His voice was the kind that didn't need volume, it just carried. Bronze Star for Valor, Operation Iraqi Freedom, 2009. Classified. He paused. Not for effect. For weight. Bronze Star for Valor, Operation Enduring Freedom, 2011. Classified. Another pause. Danielle could see Mercer's body language shifting through the gap in the door. The confidence starting to crack. Silver Star for Exceptional Heroism, Operation Iraqi Freedom, 2009. Classified. That was when Mercer interrupted, his voice climbing an octave. That's impossible. Let me see her credentials. This is fraud. This is stolen valor. His hands were shaking now. Not from fear yet, from the first icy realization that this meeting wasn't about him at all. The suit with the folder opened it slowly. The kind of slow that's meant to hurt. Dr. Raymond Mercer, you're under arrest for healthcare fraud, insurance fraud, falsifying medical records, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government. The words were spoken like they were reading him his epitaph. Because they were. The FBI has been conducting a federal investigation into St. Michael's Memorial for the past 6 months. The CEO made a sound like he'd been hit in the stomach. The second suit continued. Your brother-in-law's medical supply company has been billing this hospital for equipment never delivered. $340,000 over 18 months. Ventilators that don't exist. Monitoring systems that were never installed. Every single item falsified, every invoice forged with your authorization code. Mercer's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Morphine discrepancies in the ICU matched exactly with cell quantities from a distribution network operating out of a warehouse in College Park. You diverted medication. Resold it. We have the bank records. We have the text messages. We have the pharmacy logs. Danielle watched Mercer's face go gray. Not the gray of sick, the gray of someone watching their future collapse in real time. Insurance codes altered on 73 patient files to maximize reimbursements for procedures never performed. Emergency room visits billed as surgical interventions. Diagnostic tests listed twice on the same patient. We recovered the original charts. We recovered the altered versions. The suit's voice was relentless, a hammer falling on an anvil. Equipment failures that weren't failures at all, they were fabricated to justify replacement orders that went straight to your brother-in-law's company at 10 times the market rate. The CEO was backing toward the door. Mercer tried to speak, but the first suit cut him off with a single raised hand. A gesture that said, "You don't get to talk anymore. You don't get to lie anymore. You're done talking." Every action you took against Captain Ross was documented in real time by federal investigators embedded in hospital administration. Every write-up. Every access restriction. Every phone call you made to build a false termination case. The suit stepped directly in front of Mercer now, close enough that Mercer had to tilt his head back to look at him. You didn't just commit healthcare fraud. You obstructed a federal investigation and attempted to interfere with an intelligence operation. Those are additional counts. The second suit reached into his jacket and produced handcuffs. Not the kind used in department stores for a show. These were stainless steel, worn from use, and they made a soft metallic clink when he held them up. The sound of finality. The sound of consequences. The cuffs went on Mercer's wrists. Click! Click! His arms jerked up involuntarily, like his body was trying to reject what was happening even though his brain had already surrendered. His mouth moved but no words came. He kept looking at Harding, like if he could just make eye contact, he could explain. He could fix this. He could lawyer his way out. But there was no way out. The agents walked him out of room 347 and into the hallway. The full hallway. The hallway where the nursing staff had stopped moving. Where the residents and attending stood frozen in doorways. Where the unit board still displayed Danielle's fabricated write-ups for insubordination and procedure violations. The hallway where, just 6 months ago, every single person had quietly accepted Mercer's version of events without question. Danielle stepped back against the wall and let them pass. She was still in her civilian clothes, jeans, a t-shirt, the only thing military about her appearance, the combat boots she'd worn every day, the ones nobody had questioned because they were just shoes. The agents walked Mercer down the hallway toward the elevator like they were walking him through a museum exhibit of his own failure. Past the nursing station where he'd berated Danielle about knowing her place. Past the break room where staff had fled just to avoid sitting near her. Past every nurse he'd intimidated, every decision he'd overridden, every person he'd made smaller to feel larger. He tried to say something, "This is a misunderstanding, I have attorneys," but one of the agents just kept walking, and that was worse than any rebuke. Worse than anything Mercer could say or do, because it meant he wasn't even worth responding to anymore. He was infrastructure. He was cargo. He was already gone. The elevator doors opened. Security was holding it. Mercer's face twisted, and for a moment his composure shattered completely. His eyes went wide with the realization of what he'd done, not just the fraud, but the fact that every calculated move to protect his scheme had created a federal evidence trail so thick that 40 lawyers couldn't cut through it. The doors closed on his expression like a book shutting. Danielle heard Major Clayton ask one of the agents about the perp walk outside. Whether the press had been notified. The agent smiled and said they were already there. News vans in the parking lot. Someone had leaked it deliberately. By noon, every Atlanta station would have footage of Dr. Raymond Mercer being loaded into an FBI vehicle, his medical license effectively finished before the doors even slammed shut. Harding was still sitting up in his bed. He reached for something on his nightstand, a small box wrapped in cloth. His hand was steady. He'd been a SEAL for 27 years. He knew how to hold things that mattered. Danielle stepped into the room. Closed the door. Locked it. Harding opened the cloth and revealed a Navy cross. The medal hung from a ribbon the color of blood and sacrifice. He pressed it into Danielle's palm, and his voice dropped to the register of someone telling you something that would change you forever. Your son got the call this morning. He's coming home. The operation succeeded. The asset stayed alive because of the intelligence you gathered here. Because you didn't look away. Because you didn't compromise. He held her hand, the metal pressing into her skin. This belongs to you. From Baghdad. For what you did for me and my team. And for staying alive long enough to do it again. Danielle didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her hand closed on the medal like it was the only solid thing in a world that had just shifted on its axis. She could feel the weight of it, not just the metal, but the lives it represented. The operations. The cost. The fact that her son was alive because she'd never stopped moving forward, even when every institutional force in this hospital had tried to make her stop. The medal caught the light. It looked like fire captured in gold. 6 months later, she stood in a room with flags on both walls. The Pentagon. A hallway where generals walked and decisions changed the course of nations. She wore dress blues, her blues now, not a disguise. The uniform with her actual rank. Captain. The rank that belonged to her, earned in blood and decisions that couldn't be undone or laundered away. A vice admiral stepped forward. She recognized him from briefing documents she'd read in classified settings. He was holding something on a ribbon. The National Intelligence Medal of Honor. Awarded for operations that saved lives. For intelligence gathering that exposed a fraud network affecting 12 VA hospitals across the Southeast. For the recovery of $4.7 million in falsified claims. For courage under pressure. For refusing to compromise when compromise would have been easier. He pinned it to her dress uniform himself. The click of the backing was quiet. Definitive. Her son stood in the front row, now home from his 3rd deployment, in his own dress uniform. Petty officer first class. A SEAL like Harding had been. Like she had been. The tradition continuing. She caught his eye and he nodded once. We're here. We made it. We're okay. Harding was in the 2nd row, still in a wheelchair, but sitting straight, his medals catching light like constellations. He saluted as she passed. A salute from one operator to another. Recognition. Respect. Home. The reception afterward was in a marble room where power moved invisibly through conversations and handshakes and the subtle redistribution of national priorities. Danielle stood near a window that looked out over Washington in the afternoon sun. Her son beside her. She reached up and touched the Navy Cross on her chest, the medal Harding had given her that morning in room 347. Then she touched the National Intelligence Medal. 2 medals. 2 lives saved. One was her son's. The other was her own. A reporter approached with a camera crew, the kind who could move through federal security because the Pentagon had approved the interview. He asked what she wanted people to know. What she wanted people to understand about what had happened. Danielle's voice came out the same way it had come out in room 347. The same calm that had unnerved Mercer. The voice of someone who had already survived the worst and found that the worst was survivable. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. She let that hang in the air. Not a quote. A testimony. A promise. Her son's hand found her shoulder. Both of them in uniform. Both of them home. Both of them exactly where they needed to be. Across Atlanta, in a minimum security facility in North Georgia, Dr. Raymond Mercer was lifting boxes into a medical supply van. Orange work release coveralls. 15-year sentence. Parole eligible in 8 if he kept his record clean inside the prison walls. The corrections officer driving the van told him to move faster. The boxes he was loading now were real. Actual medical supplies going to actual clinics. Legitimate work. The closest he'd ever come to honest work in his entire career, and it was in prison, after his license was revoked and his reputation was ash and his brother-in-law had taken a plea deal that left Mercer to face the charges alone. He lifted another box. His back ached. His mind kept cycling through the same thought it had cycled through every day since the handcuffs clicked on his wrists. He'd had her. He'd had leverage. He'd had the entire institutional machinery on his side. And he'd still lost. To a nurse. To someone he'd tried to make smaller, which only meant he'd never really seen how big she was. Subscribe if you're the kind of person who believes that integrity always surfaces, no matter how many people try to bury it. Like the video if you think wrongdoing in medical institutions needs to be exposed. Comment below with your stories of standing up against corruption when everyone else was looking the other way. Because the people who speak up, they're the ones who change everything.